What's going on, everybody? Got a special video for you today. It's the whole interview. I thought about doing this part one and part two, but I think it's going to be better to leave it together as one. Bronson Arroyo, I got the chance to talk with him about a lot of stuff. We talked about Dusty Baker. We talked about the Reds season. We talked about the offseason coming up, both what the Reds might do, and then also the impending nastiness of the CBA negotiations with the players union and the owners. And I got his perspective. I got a player's perspective and the things that he went through in his playing career as Bronson Arroyo kind of breaks it all down for us here on the Locked On Reds podcast. His first ever video interview with Locked On Reds. He's been on multiple times. He's a friend of the podcast, but this is the first time getting to capture it on video. Very excited for you to check it out. This is the whole interview in its entirety. You can check out part one and part two on the audio side of things wherever you get your podcasts. But if this is your first time on the YouTube channel, make sure that you are subscribed right here to Locked On Reds so you don't miss anything that I've got coming for you this off season, because we're going to have more stuff like this. And as I get a little bit better at video editing, maybe we will break these things down into a couple of parts. So this is a little bit longer, but this is just meant to be the long form interview. You can kind of pick it up and set it down and pick it back up again as you need to. But I've got a lot of great stuff for you here on the Locked On Reds Bronson Arroyo initial YouTube interview. What is your first thought seeing Dusty get a shot at a World Series?
Oh, it's, I was a little torn between, watching with the Red Sox, not only because I have history with the Red Sox, but also because Christian Arroyo is playing second base for the Boston Red Sox. He went to my high school. We're not related, but we graduated 18 years apart. Guys used to joke that when he got drafted in the first round by the Giants, they were like, that's got to be your kid, Bronson, right? And I'm like, they're like, what do you mean? He's like, well, he's 18 and you're 36, man. It's probably that one you didn't know that got away from you, man, when you were 18 years old. And I'm like, no, but I did, I had sat with his family and talked about, I knew he had been drafted in the first round. I just wanted to give him an idea of what was going to happen when he got into pro ball, because there's a lot of myths about, how people move up in an organization or what you're going to come across in the minor leagues. You have no idea when you're an 18-year-old kid. So, I was rooting for him and the Red Sox, but also rooting for Dusty. It was hard for me to kind of pick a side now that Dusty's in a World Series for the first time as a manager. He's only been to a World Series, obviously, in '81 when he was a player.
Right.
And, I know he's been wanting this for a long time. I mean, Dusty has told some stories of winning a World Series. He's big on dreams. He's big on a lot of kind of unorthodox things about, energy. He comes into a locker room and he'll burn sage to try to get all out of the bad spirits and stuff. Like, he's into a lot of offbeat stuff. And he's always talked about winning the World Series in a red uniform. He had said that for a long time. And he obviously went from the Reds, and then he went over to the Nationals, and he was knocking on the door there. And, I'm starting to think that maybe he misinterpreted that dream and it was actually orange instead of red. So I don't know, but I'll definitely be rooting for him to get that ring.
Kind of close on the color spectrum there, red and orange. When you think about him, like, I think the first thing anybody always says when they're talking about a manager, when they're talking about a player, and they look at their career, they say, are they Hall of Fame worthy? Is it a World Series ring and then he's a shoo-in, or is he already there?
Oh, I think he's already there. Okay. I mean, for me personally, I think there's two ways you can get into the Hall of Fame in my mind. One is just to be extraordinary in a small amount of time or a shorter amount of time, like if Kershaw was to retire today.
Sure. Or
somebody who has done it over the longevity of the game, which in some ways is harder to do, because the guys that are doing it in the short term, like a Sandy Koufax, they're just extraordinary talents, but to get it done over a longer period of time means you're probably not an extraordinary talent, and you're having to just, run the race for a longer amount of time and continue to put up those consistent numbers. And, Dusty has been a winner everywhere he's gone. Even if you look in the years when people thought he was a failure or he got fired from the Nationals, he was averaging 92, 93, 94, 95 wins a year. Right. And for me personally, you win more than 90 games as a ball club, you have done your job. Regardless of what happens in the playoffs, you get to the dance. To me, that is doing your job. And to me, Dusty has been around for such a long time, not only had a great career, a 280 lifetime hitter, or very close to it. He had a fantastic playing career. And then as a manager, he's got just so many wins, and he just hasn't had the opportunity to win the big dance. And a lot of times it's not it's not just about the manager. You know, for me personally, I always lean on the players, and it's also such a razor thin edge during the playoffs. I mean, one little thing can change the whole dynamic of a series. You know, I obviously won that one in '04, and if you watch those tapes back, I mean, there was plenty of opportunities for the Yankees to put us away with just one simple out, and something strange would have happened. So you can't always just blame it on the manager.
That was something that, and I want to kind of touch on the playoff idea in a moment, just because the Braves being in the World Series, they had like the longest odds to win the World Series this year, and here they are. But when I look at Dusty, and I read this article in The Athletic, I don't know if you got a chance to see it too, where they quoted him, and he was just like, I got dismissed from so many jobs that I didn't do really wrong. Like I won. I wanted those jobs, and I still got dismissed from that. Seeing how his career has progressed, was there kind of a moment where you're just like, man, why does he keep getting such a raw deal? Because, I mean, from a fan aspect, I know that there were people that were just like, man, Brian Price is going to be a better manager than him. And then, you know, whenever the Nationals moved on and you see all these different teams moving on, how do you perceive that?
Yeah, from what I've seen and been around Dusty for 5 years, and also talking to him, you know, still to this day, we talk at least a couple times a year. And I think what it is with Dusty is he's super opinionated, right? He's really strong on what he believes in. He likes to manage from his gut, and he doesn't always like to take the statistics of the game and apply them the way that newer baseball is doing, right? So that's one reason. Now, the statistics weren't being applied quite as much back when I was with the Reds after 2013 when he was there, but he was starting to come into the game. Yeah. And you're also seeing there was a time when managers made every decision that happens on the field. You know, as somebody in the dugout was making every decision, whether it was the pitching coach or your manager. But then there became a time when the front office wanted to start infiltrating that conversation. And they wanted to start telling you why it is that Jay Bruce shouldn't be playing right field tonight because of X, Y, and Z, right? And as years have gone on, more and more information is coming from the stat guys upstairs, and they're starting to dominate that. And Dusty doesn't allow that. Yeah. Right? He's like, this is my locker room, and I'm going to run this ship. You hired me to run the ship, stay out. Right. And part of that, so you love that at first because he feels very confident. If you feel confident in the fact that he's not a wishy-washy guy. But then as 1 year goes by and you win 93, 94 games, but maybe you don't make it deep into the playoffs, and then the next year you've got some ideas that you want to implement, and Dusty is maybe kind of, you know, pushing back on those ideas. That's what I have seen over the years, is that he has found a way to, you know, to kind of butt heads with the front office on some decision making, because he came from a place when, you know, the manager made all these decisions on his own, and these days teams don't like that.
Right. And I know you've talked a lot about his character and the way that he is off the field and things like that before with me on the podcast before. In case anybody hasn't listened, they should go back and listen to those. But when it came to the playoffs, how was he as a manager? I know he probably didn't change personality-wise or things like that, but what was it like coming in each day to the locker room, you know, during that run of 2010 and 2012 and 2013?
Well, he's basically the same guy year-round. I mean, you know, the way he approaches day one of the season is the same way you felt when we were going into the playoffs. I mean, maybe you'd have a little bit more of an animated speech before a playoff game or a playoff series, but for the most part, I mean, Dusty is just such an energetic guy. He comes to the ballpark every day as if he's a player, right? And that is what the guys love about him, is that you feel like you can't imagine that a guy could be 70 years old and still make you feel like he's out on the field. And that's why you see the funny things, from the wristbands he wears that have his face on them to his toothpick to still wearing spikes sometimes in the dugout. Now, I think he stopped doing that over the last probably 5 years, but he used to wear spikes every day. Now he's wearing tennis shoes because it's probably a little more comfortable on his knees and stuff. But for the most part, he is as close to still being a player as a manager as I've ever been around. And that is very comforting. To be inside of a locker room when most managers are screaming, hey, turn the music off. You know, you guys are playing terrible. You know, turn the music off or turn the TVs off. Dusty would come to me and say, hey, man, where's the music? He's like, bro, we ain't got nothing if we ain't got no music, right? Like, he lives his life by music in a lot of ways, right? So he's this guy who lives by somewhat superstition, somewhat gut. He's got a lot of energy. He loves the offbeat things of life. He isn't all about just being kind of a straight-laced guy. And so that makes you feel like he's one of the boys. And that's what's so fun to play for him. So as the season goes on, he's always the same guy. I mean, he has these routines. I mean, if you walk into his locker room, he's got an iPod that's labeled Clubhouse iPod, for my desk. And then he's got another one that's for his car. Like, he has the things he likes and he sticks with those things, and it's part of his ritual and what has made him who he is in the game. And it's also why you stick to your guns in crunch time. And sometimes that can bite you in the butt maybe once in a while, but there's obviously been a ton of successes, and that's why he continues to get another job, year after year.
What were some of his favorite tunes?
He is so eclectic with food and music. Honestly, it'd be impossible to say. I mean, he kind of spans all genres. I asked him one time, I said, why are you such a big foodie, and why do you have such a big array of likes in that? You're not just talking about German food or Italian food, you're talking about all of them. And why is that? And he said his mother used to cook a different meal every night growing up, from a different culture. And it just kind of bled into him, and him growing up and being around Haight-Ashbury and being in that San Francisco, Sacramento scene for so many years, not only as a player, but as a kid, I think some of that rubbed off on him, and he kind of is that way musically. I mean, he goes, everything from Eric Clapton all the way to hip hop, but I think his sweet spot is probably jazz and blues. If a guy like Buddy Guy is playing around town in Chicago, he's going to go to the show, right? He likes a lot of the old cats, and that's definitely going to be a sweet spot. But he'll always surprise you and bring something out of his back pocket that you didn't think he was into, and that's just who he is.
When I always think of 2013 and the craziness of that game in Pittsburgh and kind of how everything went down. How did he react to that?
I don't specifically remember seeing his body language that day. What I remember from that game was very early on, the crowd being really intense, almost like felt like an NFL football game, because the Pirates hadn't had a playoff in a long time.
Right.
They brought the energy to the ballpark that day, and the chants of Cueto, Cueto, Cueto. And I knew we were gonna have a hard time hitting. Who they had on the mound that day was Liriano. He was a guy who was just throwing a lot of sliders, staying down in the zone. He was a guy who wasn't going to give in, and it was going to be tough to put like 2 and 3 hits together off him. So if you didn't hit a home run early in the game, it was going to be tough. And that's what I really remember from that day. I don't remember Dusty's body language. I do remember his pregame speech. He was talking about Hank Aaron and some of the old guys he had played with when he was really, really young. And he also said, let's go win one because I need another house in Hawaii. He dropped that on us that day too. He'd been talking about that house in Hawaii for a long time. I don't know if he's gotten it yet, but hopefully if he hadn't, maybe this is the year. But he's also a guy who doesn't back down from a challenge, and he definitely doesn't get nervous in big situations. He definitely loves the limelight. He knows that's what he's here to live for, right? It's not a type of guy who's like, oh, we've had a great season and now we get in the playoffs, I'm going to panic. I mean, Dusty is definitely not a guy who panics. I mean, he is, I didn't get to see him obviously, in his first few years of being a manager, but by the time I got to be around him, he was so seasoned. I mean, you kind of, you know what the game's about. And if you were a type of guy who was going to panic in big situations, I don't think you would have lasted this long. Right. So he's basically what you get on him on day one in spring training is what you're going to get during the World Series. You're not going to see much of a different personality.
Nice. You think he's got any different flavored toothpicks for the World Series?
He might. I saw him on TV the other day. He's experimenting every once in a while. Somebody had given him a couple that were soaked in some sort of like moonshine or something. Bourbon. And they said, he was, after he tried them, he said, oh, I get it now. But he's actually, since he had that stroke with us back in 2013 before the playoffs, his heart wasn't working really good, and he was retaining some water, and he went to the hospital. They were getting some of that water out and making sure that his heart was functioning better. And as he was walking out, he started actually stuttering and slurring his speech, and they realized he was having a stroke. So ever since that time, he has slowed down a little bit on his drinking and his partying, and I mean, that's the other thing that's so great about him is that not only is he the most well-informed guy inside the locker room, knowing what guys are doing, bringing food to players, know who's sick, sending flowers to somebody's mother. But he also is the guy who's out at the club at night watching Buddy Guy and bringing a T-shirt back to me signed by Buddy and being out all night. And then the first guy at the ballpark, I mean, he is just an amazing guy and so well-rounded. And, some of that obviously has had to slow down, like I said, over the years because of a little bit of health issues. And that's why you see him wearing the mask. And you see him wearing the gloves all the time now is basically to guard himself against health issues, because I believe he has some sort of cancer also in the past. So, but, a lot of times for him, it's just, he's a guy who can figure it out. I mean, I really believe that if his body would hold up, he could manage for another 20 years, because it doesn't matter how young the guys get in the locker room. If you're around Dusty and you hear him speak just for an hour, you tend to really just love the enthusiasm that he has.
It's so funny to see all the different articles talking about how, the cheating and all that stuff with Houston, and how he was the perfect guy to really kind of bring them out of that. Dude, all the stuff that they've dealt with, like, do you look at that differently, or do you just say, man, this is about Dusty, and just kind of blow through that?
I think he was the perfect guy for that job. There's no doubt. There's a lot of managers who are a lot more insecure and self-conscious about what people think about them.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact that Dusty does not care what other people think about him for the most part. He presents what he wants to present, and you can take it or leave it. And I've been sitting on a plane when he was chewing my butt out about dressing the rookies up, and he didn't want me to dress Aroldis Chapman up for the third time or whatever. And Aroldis had refused to put on the outfit, so I dressed him up again, and Dusty was chewing my butt about it. He said, I told you not to do that. Why'd you do it? And I was basically saying, that everybody from the general manager down to the guys cleaning the clubhouse thought that Aroldis was the guy who needed to put on the an outfit more than anybody else, right? Because he didn't quite have respect for authority. Sure. And Dusty screaming on the plane, that this is my mother effing team, and you can tell Walt Jockey did that right to his face, and Walt's sitting 3 seats up from him, and he's screaming. Dusty does not care. I mean, he is a guy's guy. He's a man's man, and he runs the ship the way he wants to. And I got a lot of respect for that. I think he was the perfect guy because, he wasn't there when the cheating scandal was going on, first of all. Second of all, Alex Cora played a big part in that, and that was who they were playing against on the other side of the locker room. So you really couldn't say anything about it. You got the Red Sox, manager who's been there, who was a key part of that kind of strategy to try to, defraud the game a little bit. And, Dusty is the guy, like I said, that can just take those questions from the media, and, he's going to play ball for a little while, which he did early in the season, and he said, whatever he said was probably somewhat cordial to the media. But if you ask him about it now in the middle of the playoffs, he's probably going to come at you pretty hard and be like, hey, man, it didn't have nothing to do with me. Right. So let's just play baseball. And that's the way he is. And that's what you need sometimes. It was part of who I was as a pitcher too, that I was easygoing. But at the end of the day, I would say what I needed to say inside of a locker room or anywhere else to make sure that I could be clear of mind coming to the ballpark every day and really enjoy an atmosphere, and not let some sort of outside entity, whether it was media or fans or whatever it is, kind of like stick in your craw a little bit and kind of upset your being every day. Dusty wants to come to the park and feel happy-go-lucky, and let's get after it. Let's play some music and let's play some good baseball.
I'm pulling for him. I'm glad that he's made it, and I really hope he gets that ring. Kind of wanted to talk to you about the season a little bit for the Reds, like kind of in retrospective what happened, because there's two ways to look at it. For most people, we kind of wanted the Reds to be in the playoffs this year. We thought that they had the talent and they were going to be able to stretch it and make it to the playoffs. But then there's also the aspect, because that's a little bit disappointing that they did, but then there's the also aspect, it's the 5th best record they've had since the turn of the century. So when you look at this season, how do you sum it up? As from the perspective of, I know what it's like and how hard it is to make the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a success, hands down. Okay. I mean, I know the fans don't want to hear that, because at the end of the day, it's almost like, you're disappointed if your team doesn't win the World Series, and that's what a fan is supposed to want.
Yeah.
But realistically, you've got one of 30 teams wins it every year. Watching the game the other night, and they said something like, the Braves won the division 15 times years in a row when they had Greg Maddux and those guys, right? And they said something, I thought, last night, where they said this is the 10th time the Braves have gone to the World Series in the history of their team. Mm-hmm. The Braves have been one of the winningest teams since I've been alive, and they've only been to the World Series 10 times in the history of the game, right? How many times do you get to the big dance? It doesn't happen that often. You can't expect it every 3rd year, every 5th year. You can't even expect it every 20 years. It's just, it's got to be your time. You got to have a little bit of luck on your side. You've got to have the guys stay healthy. You've got to have the ball bounce your way, and you've got to have a damn good ball club as well. And I personally think that, baseball is the toughest sport to make the playoffs in. A lot of other sports like hockey, they allow, much more bigger percentage of the teams of the league get into the playoffs every year. And in baseball, we don't have that, even with the wild card game. And so for me, if you're one of the 8 teams that is in the playoffs, you have done your job. We set out in spring training in February, and it's such a long road. And if you can just get into the playoffs, to me, you've done your job. If you get knocked out of the playoffs, it just wasn't your time. And a team that was better than you on that given week just beat you. But so for me, the Reds season was an absolute success. I mean, they kept us in it all year. They kept us intrigued. Joey Votto showed a different side of himself that we know he can probably hold up for the next 2 or 3 years. The pitching staff, he didn't start off very good. Obviously, Luis Castillo, if he gets off to a better start, the team probably wins 6 or 7 more games. Maybe they do make the playoffs, but these guys made it fun. That's the best team and the best season they've had since 2013 when we lost to the Pirates in that wild card game. And that is, that's the realistic point of view. If you want a team to win a World Series or even to get deep in the playoffs, it's just, I watched the Red Sox the other night, and I'm going to have a conversation probably with Christian Arroyo at some point and say, hey man, there's nothing to hold your head down about, because at the end of the day, you've tasted what it's like to be deep in a playoff run. Right. And there's a lot of guys like Ken Griffey Jr. played for 20 years and never got to taste that. And a lot of guys who played the game don't have a World Series ring. And we're talking about Dusty. He's been managing forever, and he's never been into a World Series as a manager until now. And so you got to take the team that you've assembled in the beginning of the year. You do the best you can, and if you can be hunting for a playoff spot in the last 10 days of the season, to me that's an exciting year. It's a fun year for the Cincinnati Reds. They brought some magic back to the ballpark, and if they can parlay that into next year and give us that same type of excitement, they have hands down done their job. Now, if you go another 3 or 4 or 5 years now and you don't even have a chance to compete in the division, then it doesn't feel like it was for real. Right. And hopefully that doesn't happen.
I know for you personally, you got to be in the booth a little bit for the Reds and Indians series. Are you going to do any more of that next year?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Usually I just get a text message from Karen Forgas, who's in the front office there, and she put some of that stuff together, and she asked me if I want to do some stuff. And I think I did a pregame show with Sam LeCure. Just near the end of the season, I was going in to watch a ball game at the end. It was probably it was already after they seemed like they had already been out of it, after they lost the Pirate series. Mm-hmm. But I stop in when I get a chance and do some of that stuff. I'd love to do a little bit more, but I'm always so busy. It's hard sometimes to pin down a day or 3 days to go do that. But it's always fun to talk baseball, to watch baseball, especially if you know something personal about the guys. Now, as the team slowly dismantles, and the 10 to 12 to 15 guys that were in that locker room this year that I know on a personal level, when they're all gone, it makes it a little harder. It's like you can watch guys on TV. You can watch a Moustakas play, but I don't really know him. And it's hard to really see underneath the hood and behind the veil of a guy in his persona that he has on TV if you don't know him inside that locker room. And that's what I really loved about being around the game, is still knowing some of these guys, and why I feel connected to the Reds, because I was here for such a long time that I know a lot about some of the young players. But we'll see, as years go on. I mean, you never know. Barry Larkin probably never thought he'd be in the booth, and he is. So you never know what could happen.
Yeah, that's true. Kind of talking about this offseason, there's something that we looked at the fans' perspective on the playoffs versus a winning season during the regular season. A lot of fans are worried that the front office isn't going to do anything, that there's not going to be any movement. As a player, when you saw a year that you're like, man, it feels like we were probably a couple wins away from really blowing this thing wide open. If they go out and they do X, Y, Z next year, we're ready to go.
Right.
Did you have that mentality, or was it kind of I'm worried about, making sure that I'm good during the off season and prepared for the next year?
I mean, for the most part, you're worried about yourself. I mean, especially being a starting pitcher, staying healthy for, 20 years like I did is almost impossible without thinking about it almost 365 days a year. I mean, it just wasn't happenstance that happened to me. It was a lot of forethought about your rest and your nutrition and your workouts and how you're going to, survive this grind and stay healthy. So I would say the majority of it would be that. You obviously would want the front office to go out and add a key piece, whether we needed a closer or maybe a power hitting guy playing left field or something. You would want that. But, is something very strange in baseball. I would say it's probably that way in every sport. It's probably that way in every industry. I mean, it's hard to get the people who own the businesses to open up their books.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost impossible. I mean, I don't think sports owners open up their books for anybody. Right. They don't want people to see behind that veil. They don't want to know how much money they're making, because then, obviously the players would have more leverage to ask for more money. And that being said, what goes on in the front office and in those really tight-knit meetings that the manager is not privy to. Right. I mean, when I would go in to talk to Brian Price or Dusty Baker and they'd say, maybe, hey, what's the front office telling you? Are they going to sign you back for another couple of years? I'm asking Dusty the same thing, and he doesn't know what's going on with me, and I don't know what's going on with him, and we're both just kind of going through our agent trying to figure out what the organization wants to do. You would think that a manager who's been there for multiple years, like a Dusty Baker, would be inside the meetings, and he'd be saying, hey, if we have the money, I want Sin Shu Chu on this ball club next year. I need Joey Votto signed for 2 more seasons. I want Bronson Arroyo for 2 more, even though you think he's getting old. Whatever it is, those conversations are not happening with baseball people. That's just business people. And because of that, you don't know what's going on inside the organization. So, if they don't go out and sign a big piece, maybe Phil Castellini could sit here and have this podcast with you, and he could explain to you what's going on, and he could tell you why it is they do and don't sign certain guys, and in years if they actually lost money or if they didn't lose money, or what their break-even point is, or how they view the game when it comes to ownership and how much money they need to make, and then how much of that you're willing to spend or lose to win more baseball games, right? Nobody knows what this is, and every individual owner obviously is different in the way he thinks about it, and the people that are invested into that organization, how do they think about it? When the Red Sox sit around the table, it's not just going to be one guy. It's going to be, you're going to have Tom Warner there. You're going to have a group of people who invested in this company, and they view it as a business. And obviously winning is a successful business for the most part, but you never get a direct answer from these guys ever, and they don't have the conversation with you. So, from a fan's perspective, you want the Reds to just go out and be like, we're right on the verge. Why don't you just go get a $200 million starter, go get Max Scherzer, and let's call it a day, right?
Right.
That's what you want to say. And it would be really nice to know if that would be possible. Or if maybe the guys in the front office or in the ownership are just so greedy that they can't let it go. You want to try to win with a team that is undervalued. Like, it's very difficult to compete against the Los Angeles Dodgers when they have a TV deal that's worth $3 billion and the Reds TV deal is worth maybe a tenth of that, if not or less, right? And so it's hard. I've had those conversations with Phil Castellini, not about the numbers, but about how hard it is to be an under market, a smaller market team, and how the game is continuing to get more and more imbalanced, and how hard it is to try to make the playoffs on a club like this. And there's a lot of moving parts here. And unless, like I said, that they want to be totally transparent, which no one ever does, and that's the way I've lived my life, is very transparent. And I think that is the best policy. But across the board, I mean, people who make a lot of money in the world, they're never open in the books.
It's interesting you say that, because there was that news thing that came out, and it was like, I think literally earlier on Monday, ESPN reported that there's pretty much a foregone conclusion that it's going to be a lockout on December the 2nd because of all the CBA stuff and how far apart the owners and the union are, despite what Rob Manfred had said. I think it was probably about a month and a half ago. He tried to make some statement, said that everything's peachy keen, and nobody bought it. What was there ever a point in your career where you had to deal with stuff like that? And how do you view what's coming? Because for most people who look at the sport, they understand what's coming, and it's probably not going to be very good.
Yeah. I've definitely had my fair share of conversations back when Donald Fear was the head of our union. Those were the early days for me. My first big league camp was 1997. It was the first time I sat in a union meeting, and I had no idea what I was in for. I didn't know what a union meeting meant. And when you sit there and listen to the seriousness and the bitter taste that was still in their mouth from 1994, and how many guys lost money, and how much it impacts people's lives, and also from the player standpoint, how greedy the owners seem to be. Right. That's from our standpoint, but we obviously don't get to see the ins and outs of everything. So that's just what we're assuming. Those meetings were eye-opening, man. In that first year, I mean, they were talking about a lot of stuff that I had no idea what was going on. And as you play the game and the longer you're in the big leagues, you learn a little bit more about arbitration. You learn a little bit more about free agency. You learn a little bit more about, things that can happen, like collusion. or, owners talking in the offseason and guys getting the same offers from multiple teams. All these things you don't think about when you're young. And so I've definitely had my fair share of the stuff. I felt like while I was playing, we were never on the verge of a strike. Since 94, in my mind, I felt like the deal was always going to get done. Since Tony Clark has taken over the union, the first couple of negotiations and the first few years that have gone by have been very, very easy. The owners were making a lot of money. Everybody was doing good, but COVID has thrown a curveball to people. And also there's just more information out there. As time goes on, people evolve, right? Organizations evolve. And I think players get more hip to the game and owners get more hip to the game about, where they're losing money and where maybe we shouldn't be giving the players this big of a pension when they retire or whatever it is, right? There's all these moving parts going on. And each side is trying to be as efficient as they possibly can. And what that ends up being is maybe a little bit of butting heads, a little bit of a dogfight over some things. And the last couple of CBAs have been very, very easy. And people are smelling and have sensed that there's something brewing and that it's not going to be quite so easy this time. So it's going to be very interesting. I definitely wouldn't want to be in the prime of my career sitting at home, on the verge of a strike. I mean, that would have driven me nuts if I had to be sitting at home while... in 94, there's guys who were working at UPS and guys who were playing, softball, who were in a big league uniform with your big league manager in the big league locker room getting prepared for a major league season. Right. And all the real players, for the most part, were sitting out at home and have no way of crossing that line without having some sort of negative put on them as a scab for the rest of their career.
Right.
Right. And it would be a very, very odd situation to be in, and just as odd at the minor league level, because I know guys who became scabs, which for anyone who doesn't know what that is, that's somebody who went over and played one game in spring training during the lockout as a major league player, but was affiliated with the team. Right. And I blame the teams for that. How could you let a guy like Jim Leyland, a legendary manager of the Pittsburgh Pirates, come into your minor league complex and look at a young kid like a Bronson Arroyo and say, "Hey, man, I want you at the big league park tomorrow"? What am I supposed to say to Jim Leland? No,
right? It's an opportunity.
Yes, it's an opportunity, and it's the man who I'm supposed to be playing for here in a couple of years. What's going to happen if I tell him no? Right. So baseball and the union should have protected the minor league guys and said, these guys are not allowed to be picked from. You can't touch them, right? But that didn't happen. And you get guys like Kevin Millar, who crossed the line for one day, took a couple of at-bats, and then had his uncle call him and say, "Hey, man, I don't think that's a good idea. Go back to the minor leagues, and then for the rest of your career, not only be labeled a bad guy, but also not get union dues, not get that $20,000, $30,000 check for the next 10 years at the end of the season that everybody else was getting, And so... there's a lot of stuff when it comes to the CBA and those agreements with the owners. And, I've never been in the room having those conversations, and I'm probably glad I never had to, but, it's going to be a very interesting offseason.
I was going to say, those meetings don't sound like the type that have like donuts and coffee. That sounds like the type where everybody's
this is a Bill Gates divorce. I mean, this is like two lawyers sitting on each side of each person, and it's part of the reason why Tony Clark has gotten some criticism for being the head of the union, because in years past, Michael Weiner, who passed away from brain cancer, and he had taken over for Donald Fear, and for a lot of years, those guys were high profile lawyers, right? And you felt like you had some sort of a leverage because they were just smart as a whip when it came to business in that way. And Tony, being an ex-player, he brings something to the table in that regard, but he doesn't bring that lawyership, on that side. And you're dealing with a bunch of sharks here, man. I mean, these are big dogs you're playing with, right? This is not a little petty game you're playing with. And so, there's been some skepticism on what's going to happen going forward, because like I said, the last couple of agreements went pretty smooth. I mean, they were, the biggest thing they were arguing over in the last one was meal money.
Right.
I mean, and clubhouse dues. I mean, that kind of stuff just didn't happen in the past. I mean, that stuff was just peanuts. And we're talking about some bigger issues, whether it's a salary cap or limiting free agency or whatever was going on. And at this point, I think some things are going to, try to change. And from a player's perspective, is what they've always told us, is that once they take something off the table, you're probably never going to get it back.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why you're so hard up to not give up something that's a key piece of free agency or something like that, because in the end, without that free market, then it just starts limiting guys and the amount of money they're allowed to make.
Makes sense. I remember them saying that was kind of a hang up toward the universal DH in between, because they had it in 2020, didn't have it this year. And the reason for it was the owners were like, well, we'll give you that if you give us playoffs or like expanded playoffs or something like that. I forget what it's going to be. It's going to be interesting to watch. And you made the good point. The first guy that I think of is Nick Castellanos, because he's got the ability to opt out and go make more money like he deserves after that amazing year that he had. Right. But if he makes himself a free agent and then they lock it out, then what? Right. I mean, that would suck.
Right. Yeah. Where do your negotiations go?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you've got owners who are wanting to negotiate with players, but you've got this other big elephant in the room that you're having to deal with, which is, are we even going to play? Right. And, they haven't been close to that at all. So it'll be interesting to see, and in this day and age, there's so many players that are in the game now that have never even, been anywhere near a strike.
Right.
They've never felt what it's like, as I never did, to have to be, in the prime of your career, making the most money in that one specific year. And they're saying, hey man, you're going to have to stick to your guns and stay home for the good of everybody else that's going to play after you. Not for you and not for your teammates, but for the guys who are going to play 20 years from now. You're going to have to stick to your guns and stay home for a while. And maybe you're not going to get paid for half of that contract. And that's, with guys already not making half their salaries or whatever they didn't get from COVID in 2020, guys have already taken a hit. And obviously owners have taken a hit too, and they're going to say the same thing. So it's, it's a high stakes game of kind of chicken sometimes, and see who blinks first. And, the good thing is that in baseball, the guys that really started the union back in the 70s for us were really did us a service to put something together that could protect the players the best you possibly could, given the circumstances. If you look at football, you look at hockey, you look at all these other leagues, they've been light years behind us when it comes to protecting the players in the union. And that came from the guys who started it way back. Right. In the days when Koufax and guys were still playing on the Dodgers.
Put it up then. I appreciate you for coming on again and donating so much of your time to me.
Sure, man.
I had one final question, and it's not really a small question. It's kind of a bigger one. But when you look at a pitcher, what tells you that he's good?
I'd say, I'm not a great judge of how good a guy is in the short term. So for instance, if I go watch a high school game, I've been with the guy who drafted me, right? Scott Lovekamp was my scout. Mm. He's a big dog with the Yankees now. He scouts pitchers 365 days a year around the country, high school and college kids. He lives for it. And we'll go to a game and we'll watch a high school kid, and he'll say, Bronson, he's like, what do you think about this guy? And I was like, man, he looks fantastic, dude. He's throwing like 91, 92, right? Right side. He's got a good breaking ball. He's like, he's throwing 83 to 85, man. He's like, he's terrible. This guy's barely going to play out of junior college. And I'm like, I give everybody more credit than maybe they deserve, So for me personally, if I'm watching a guy just once in one game or just in a quick snapshot, it's very difficult to tell. If I sit in a dugout and I'm watching a guy every fifth day, and I can watch him for a little while, give me a couple of months with him, and I can watch how he reacts in all these different situations, and also what kind of guy he is inside the locker room tells me a lot, right? And to find out how gritty a guy is, does he kind of cave when the pressure gets on? Does he rise to those occasions like a Sonny Gray in the big moments? Is he really consistent with his workouts? What does he think about food? How much does he like to party? Right. There's all these factors that go into kind of figuring out somebody's character. And it's like, I'm going to figure out your character, and then I'm going to figure out what your character is on the mound. And when I put those two things together, it's going to tell me about what kind of season you could have year after year after year, or if you're not capable of that. Mm-hmm. And that is where I really think I will dial it down. And if I had to say one thing that makes a guy good, for me personally, it's consistency. Mm-hmm. It's very rare to get a guy, guys I played with, let's say, a very regimented, Mike Leake was very regimented. I was very regimented. And it's why you look at our career and it's kind of, just very flat line. There's not these huge up and downs where you win 21 games and then you're hurt for 2 years. You just, you're winning 12, 13, 14 games every year and just nice and consistent. And maybe you're not, you're never going to be a number one or number two in the game, but you know what you're going to get out of us. Mm. Right. But then you take a guy like Edinson Volquez. And if I watch Edinson, he's working out unbelievably hard sometimes, and then sometimes just missing his workouts. There's times where he's sitting in the dugout during the game when he's in between innings. Other times I go up top and he's eating a bag of Doritos in the middle of the game while he's pitching, right? And so you've got this kind of erratic behavior. in a lot of ways, and a lot of times then that shows in the consistency of who they are as a major league player, not for one specific season, but over the long haul in the back of their baseball card. Right. And so that generally is what I would be looking at for a guy. But if you're just talking about just pure like physical ability, what makes a guy good, I would just dial it down to this. If I was sifting a pitcher down, the best pitchers in the game have an idea of where to throw the ball and how to make a consistent shape with the ball. Right. So if you're talking about a sinker, right? A good sinker is supposed to go down and into a right-hander. That's where you get a lot of ground balls. So you're throwing a fastball that's going down and in just a little bit. If you throw it down and in, and it kind of goes, if it goes straight down one time, and then the next time it just goes straight across into his belt. If you're kind of that erratic with your command, even the shape of the pitch, you have less likely of a chance to be really good. The guys who are really good know how to make a certain shape with the pitch, and they know how to throw strikes with it. When you pair those two things together, you get a really consistent starter. You pair that with a guy who can do that with great stuff like a Pedro Martinez or a Garrett Cole. That's when you get a true number one and a true superstar and somebody who has the ability to win, 60% of his games.
Nice. Because I always think, I'm like, man, it feels like Castillo and Gray, like it feels like the talent's there, and it just there's something that's a disconnect to really having them being in that upper echelon of the league, because I felt like they could be, and I know that Castillo really struggled to begin this year, and he had an amazing comeback in the second half of the year, the way that he performed. But you just look at those first 2 months, and you're like, man, and kind of like you said, it's the up and the down.
Right.
And what is he going to do to fix that next year?
Right. Well, part of the problem is that the faster you drive a car, the harder it is to control.
Yeah.
Right. And so as you're getting guys these days, everybody's throwing so hard. You take Castillo, he's throwing the ball up to 100 miles an hour. And if you look at Sonny Gray, a lot of his pitches are max effort. Even if he's not throwing up around 100, but you really hear him grunting. He's getting after it almost with every pitch. When you do that, you're taking a little bit of your command away. The closer you get to putting the pedal all the way to the metal, your command is going to be off a little bit. And that's basically what happens. So in order to be really consistent command-wise, you're going to have to dial it back just a bit. And so if you can dial it back just a bit and have that better command over the consistent haul of the whole season, you can then start closing in on some of those gaps, which means maybe you take away the ability to have those huge outings when you give up 8 runs in 2 innings, right? You can maybe pull those back and you don't have so many of those. And then you take a guy like Louis, who almost found a way to have a sub-4 ERA with that terrible start. But now, if he does what I'm talking about, maybe you push that all the way down to where he has that 2.8 ERA. And now you're talking in that Kershaw land where he lived for his whole career, right? And so there's a give and take between stuff and command, and that's basically the two moving parts inside of a starting pitcher. And a lot of times guys are really fearful of getting outs without their best stuff, and so guys are always going max effort all the time, and you're lacking a little bit of command. It's what made Greg Maddux absolutely genius, was that he just pitched inside of softer, which just made his command that much better. He wasn't obviously deeper in the game. You're not getting tired. You feel just as fresh in the 7th inning as you did in the 2nd. There's a lot of dominoes that get saved by pulling back just a little bit. But there's not a lot of guys who feel like they can get away with that, just mentally in their mind. They don't want to get beat with second-rate stuff. You almost have to convince yourself that I can get outs with less. And when you do that, then I think you start parlaying. Instead of only pitching 5 2/3 every single night for the whole season, you're now into the 7th inning every night. I did not have anywhere near extraordinary stuff. Like, I had very decent stuff, pretty good command, and a probably above average breaking ball. But if anybody looked at my stuff, they'd probably tell you that Bronson pitched 5 years in the big leagues, 2 of them as a starter, 3 in the bullpen, and he was done. Right? That's the kind of stuff I had, and I averaged, if you take from the day I started in the minor leagues, I'm 18 years old, take every start from 18 all the way to age 40 and divide up the innings pitched by those games, I averaged 6 1/3 innings my whole career. So I was in the 7th inning every single night. And for guys like Louis Castillo, who have way better stuff than me, and Sonny Gray, there's no reason why they can't make that happen all the time. Part of it, obviously, is that managers are pulling guys a little quicker these days because bullpens are more powerful. But at the end of the day, it's there. They've got the stuff to be able to do it. It's just a matter of putting those pieces together to go from, a solid, number two to being a true ace of the game. If you look at Clayton Kershaw's numbers, his numbers are so much better than a guy like Louis Castillo, but stuff-wise, they're just as comparable. I mean, Louis probably has better stuff, but Clayton has this way of being consistent with his shape and his command over a long haul, and he just knows how to beat guys.